What happens when one of country music's most respected artists comes face-to-face with a talk show host who refuses to back down from controversial questions? Well, you're about to witness one of the most explosive confrontations ever captured on live TV. Tonight, we're diving deep into the moment that had Chris Stapleton walking off the Jimmy Kimmel live set, leaving millions of viewers stunned and the internet buzzing for weeks. This wasn't your typical celebrity interview gone wrong. This was a masterclass in tension, building moment by moment until it reached a breaking point that nobody saw coming. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us what you think really caused this whole situation to explode the way it did. The tension in Studio 6A was palpable from the moment Chris Stapleton settled into the guest chair across from Jimmy Kimmel. What started as routine pre-show banter had already taken an uncomfortable turn during the commercial break. And now, with cameras rolling live to millions of households across America, both men seemed determined to make their points heard. So, Chris, welcome back to the show, Jimmy began, his trademark grin feeling slightly forced as he shuffled his index cards. I have to say, your new album has been getting incredible reviews, but there's been some interesting commentary about your recent statements regarding the music industry. Chris shifted slightly in his chair, his piercing blue eyes never leaving Jimmy's face. Well, Jimmy, I've always been pretty straightforward about my feelings on how the business side of things has changed. Music used to be about the song, about the story you're trying to tell. Right, Jimmy nodded. But there was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't quite ready to let this remain a comfortable conversation. But when you say the industry has lost its way, some people are interpreting that as you taking shots at other artists who maybe approach their careers differently than you do. The studio audience sensed the shift immediately. What started as warm applause was now replaced by an almost electric silence, the kind that happens when people realize they're witnessing something unexpected unfold in real time. Chris leaned forward slightly, his voice remaining calm but carrying an edge that hadn't been there moments before. Jimmy, I think there's a difference between taking shots at people and simply stating what you believe in. I've never mentioned specific names, never called anyone out directly. I talk about music, about authenticity, about what I think makes a great song great. But come on, Jimmy pressed, his media-trained smile starting to fade around the edges. When you're talking about authenticity in country music, everyone knows you're referring to the pop country crossover artists, the ones who are dominating the charts right now. Isn't that a little bit like throwing stones from a glass house? The question hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Chris's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for a moment, the only sound in the studio was the barely audible hum of the cameras and lights. A glass house, Chris repeated, his voice dropping to a lower register that anyone familiar with his music would recognize as dangerous territory. Jimmy, I've been writing and performing music for over 20 years. I've written songs for artists across every genre. I've played dive bars and sold-out arenas, and I've never once compromised what I believe makes music worth listening to. Jimmy sensed he had struck a nerve, and rather than backing away, he seemed to double down. I'm not questioning your credentials, Chris, but let's be honest here. You've built a pretty significant part of your brand on being the guy who keeps it real. The authentic voice in a sea of manufactured pop country. That's a pretty convenient position to take when you're already successful. The audience was now completely silent. Even the production crew seemed to have stopped their usual behind-the-scenes movement. This was no longer a typical late-night interview. This was something else entirely. Chris sat back in his chair, his hands clasped together in front of him. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the kind of quiet intensity that made everyone in the room lean forward slightly. Convenient, he said, the word coming out like he was tasting something bitter. Jimmy, there's nothing convenient about standing up for what you believe in when it means turning down opportunities. when it means saying no to people who want to change your sound, when it means watching other people take shortcuts while you stick to your principles. But that's exactly my point, Jimmy interrupted, his voice gaining momentum. You act like you're the guardian of some sacred tradition, but music evolves. Chris, it changes. And maybe, just maybe, the artists you seem to have such a problem with are just adapting to what audiences actually want to hear. The words hit Chris like a physical blow. For the first time since the interview began, his carefully maintained composure cracked just slightly. His eyes narrowed, and when he leaned forward this time, there was no mistaking the fire building behind his usually measured demeanor. What audiences want to hear, he repeated slowly, or what record labels want to sell them. Jimmy's smile had completely disappeared, now replaced by something that looked more like a challenge than his usual late-night host charm. That's a pretty cynical way to look at it, Chris. You're basically saying that millions of people who buy these records, who stream these songs, who sing along at concerts, that they're all just being manipulated? I'm saying that when you focus group a song to death, Chris replied, his voice steady but unmistakably heated. When you write by committee, when you're more concerned about fitting a radio format than telling a truth, then, yeah, I think something gets lost. And I think people can feel that difference even if they can't always put their finger on what it is. The studio audience was shifting uncomfortably now. This wasn't the playful banter they had expected from a country music star's appearance on a comedy show. This was raw, unfiltered disagreement playing out in real time, and everyone could sense that neither man was willing to back down. Jimmy leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. Okay, so let me ask you this then. If authenticity is so important to you, how do you explain the fact that your biggest hits, the songs that really put you on the map, were written years before you recorded them? Isn't there something a little calculated about holding on to songs until the perfect moment to release them? Chris's hands, which had been resting calmly on the arms of his chair, suddenly clenched into fists. The question had clearly crossed a line, and the change in his demeanor was immediate and unmistakable. Calculated, Chris's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more menace than if he had been shouting. Jimmy, those songs were written from places of pain, from experiences that shaped who I am as a person. The reason I held on to them wasn't calculation. It was because they meant too much to me to just throw them away on the wrong project. But you did wait, Jimmy pressed, seemingly oblivious to or unconcerned by the warning signs that Chris was reaching his breaking point. You waited until you had your solo deal, until the timing was right for your career. That sounds pretty strategic to me. The silence that followed was deafening. Chris stared at Jimmy with an intensity that made several people in the front row of the audience visibly uncomfortable. When he finally spoke, his words came out measured and deliberate, like he was choosing each one carefully. You want to talk about strategy, Jimmy? Chris said slowly. Let's talk about strategy. Let's talk about how you book guests on this show specifically to create moments like this, to get clips that will go viral, to generate controversy that keeps people talking about your program. Jimmy's face flushed slightly, but he maintained his composure. That's a pretty serious accusation. Chris, are you saying I brought you on here just to ambush you? I'm saying that you've spent the last 10 minutes trying to get me to say something inflammatory about other artists. And when I wouldn't take the bait, you decided to attack my integrity directly. Chris replied, his voice gaining strength and conviction with each word. You want authentic? This is what authentic looks like. This is what happens when someone refuses to play your game. The production team behind the cameras was in crisis mode now. Producers were whispering frantically into their headsets, trying to figure out how to handle a situation that was spiraling beyond their control. The show was broadcasting live, and there was no way to edit out what was happening. Jimmy seemed to realize that he had pushed too far, but instead of backing down, he doubled down once again. Look, Chris, I think you're taking this way too personally. This is just a conversation. This is what talk shows are supposed to be about. We ask questions. We discuss things. We try to get to the truth. The truth? Chris laughed, but there was no humor in it whatsoever. The truth is that you invited me here under the pretense of promoting my music. And instead, you spent the entire time trying to make me look like some kind of elitist who looks down on other artists. The truth is that you're more interested in creating drama than actually talking about music. I think you're being a little dramatic here, Jimmy said, his tone taking on a condescending quality that was like pouring gasoline on an already raging fire. This is television, Chris. This is entertainment. People tune in to see interesting conversations, not just softball questions about your latest single. Chris stood up slowly, his chair making a small scraping sound against the studio floor that seemed to echo through the unnaturally quiet space. The movement was deliberate, controlled, but everyone in the room understood that something fundamental had just shifted. Entertainment? Chris repeated, standing now at his full height and looking down at Jimmy, who remained seated behind his desk. So, my music, my career, my principles, those are all just entertainment to you. They're just content for your show? Jimmy's confidence seemed to waver for the first time since the interview began. Chris, come on, sit back down. Let's talk about this like adults. We are talking about this like adults, Chris replied, his voice now carrying the full weight of his anger and disappointment. Adults don't ambush their guests. Adults don't try to manipulate people into saying things they'll regret later. Adults show respect for the people they invite into their space. The camera operators were getting signals from their directors, unsure whether to keep rolling or cut away. The audience sat in stunned silence, many of them pulling out their phones to record what they were witnessing. This was television history in the making, the kind of moment that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. Jimmy finally stood up as well, perhaps realizing that the power dynamic had completely shifted with Chris towering over him from across the desk. Okay, let's just take a step back here. I think we're both getting a little heated, and maybe we should just reset this whole conversation. Reset? Chris's voice carried a bitter edge that cut through the studio like a knife. Jimmy, you can't just reset when things don't go the way you planned. You can't just rewind and pretend like the last 15 minutes didn't happen. This isn't a rehearsal. This isn't a bit. This is real life. The desperation in Jimmy's voice was becoming more apparent with each exchange. Chris, look, I understand you're upset, but we're live on television right now. We've got millions of people watching. Maybe we should just move on to talking about your tour, about your new album? Now you want to talk about my music? Chris shook his head in disbelief. After spending this entire interview trying to tear down everything I stand for, now you want to pivot to the safe questions? Now you want to play it straight? Jimmy's hands were visibly shaking slightly as he tried to regain control of the situation. I wasn't trying to tear down anything, Chris. I was asking legitimate questions about your public statements. That's what journalists do. That's what interviewers do. Journalists? Chris's laugh was sharp and humorless. Jimmy, you're a comedian who hosts a talk show. You're not Bob Woodward. You're not conducting some kind of investigative piece. You invited me here to promote my album, and instead, you decided to turn it into an ambush interview because you thought it would make good television. The studio crew was in full panic mode now. The director was making frantic hand signals, trying to figure out if they should cut to commercial. But the confrontation was happening too fast and too unpredictably to find a natural break point. I think you're completely missing what happened here, Jimmy said, his voice rising slightly as he tried to reassert some authority in the situation. I asked you about statements you made publicly. Statements that were reported in major publications. If you didn't want to discuss them, you shouldn't have made them in the first place. That was the final straw. Chris's composure, which had been hanging by a thread for the last several minutes, finally snapped completely. Chris paused, his hand resting on the back of the guest chair. Looking out at the audience, his eyes filled with resolve. The room was so silent that even the hum of the cameras seemed deafening. He slowly turned to face Jimmy one last time, his voice calm but unwavering. "Jimmy, you had your chance to talk about music. You could have asked me about my career, my writing, my craft. But instead you made it about controversy, about sparking conflict for ratings. This isn't just an interview. It's a platform to create meaningful conversations. And you turned it into a circus." He looked down at his microphone, held it in his hands for a moment, and then handed it off to a stunned production assistant. "This isn't what I came here for." Jimmy, his face now a mixture of frustration and regret, stepped forward, his hands raised in a pleading gesture. "Chris, don't do this. We can finish it. We can talk about music, talk about your tour, think about the fans. This isn't the way to end it." Chris looked straight into the camera, his gaze unflinching, as if speaking directly to his audience, to his supporters. "My fans know who I am. They know I won't compromise on my beliefs. I've never backed down from speaking my truth, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it costs me something." He took a deep breath and gave one final look at Jimmy, his expression unwavering. "I'm not here to play games. I'm here for real conversations, not manipulations." And with that, he turned and walked toward the exit, leaving the studio in a stunned silence, his footsteps echoing through the tense air. The cameras caught every moment of his exit, broadcasting it live as the audience sat in disbelief. Jimmy stood there, unable to move, the weight of what had just transpired sinking in. "Chris, please don't do this," he called out, his voice more strained now, desperate. "We're live. We still have time left. Think about the viewers, your label. Think about your fans." But Chris didn't turn back. His back was to him now, his steps purposeful as he moved toward the door. As he reached it, he paused briefly, his hand on the door handle. He turned to face Jimmy one last time, his voice sharp with finality. "You got your moment, Jimmy. Hope it was worth it." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving the studio frozen in silence. The tension, the rawness of the confrontation, lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. The crew, the audience, and even Jimmy Kimmel were left to process what they had just witnessed. Not just an interview gone wrong, but a complete breakdown of everything that was supposed to be entertainment. This was a moment that would not be forgotten. Chris's eyes locked onto Jimmy's with a quiet intensity that left no room for doubt about his resolve. He slowly removed his microphone, the sound of the clip snapping as it was detached reverberating through the room. "You want to know what I think, Jimmy?" Chris began, his voice firm, steady, and colder than before. "I think you're exactly what's wrong with this whole industry. You don't care about music. You don't care about art. You care about making noise, getting your viral moment. That's it." Jimmy, visibly shaken, shot back quickly, his usual host persona unraveling. "I've had hundreds of musicians on this show. I've promoted albums, helped launch careers. Just because I ask tough questions doesn't mean I don't respect what you do." Chris stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the floor with a deliberate, purposeful sound. The room seemed to hold its breath as he towered over Jimmy. "Respect?" Chris repeated, his voice now sharp, his calm demeanor replaced with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You call this respect? You bring me on, act like you want to talk about music, and then spend the entire time trying to bait me into tearing other artists down. That's not respect, Jimmy. That's exploitation." The audience was silent, the energy in the studio thick with tension. Even the production team, usually behind the scenes and in full control, seemed stunned by what was unfolding. This wasn't just an interview. It had become a battle of principles. Jimmy tried to regain control, his voice shaking slightly as he pushed back. "Chris, maybe the problem is that you're too wrapped up in your own self-righteous bubble. You can't handle someone questioning your precious principles." Chris leaned in, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You want to talk about self-righteousness? You spend your whole career pushing drama, creating controversy, just to get the clicks. You think that's what music and real conversation are about? It's about respect, Jimmy. Something you clearly don't understand. Jimmy's face flushed, but he wasn't ready to back down yet. You're making a mistake here. People are going to say you couldn't handle a few tough questions. Chris shook his head, eyes narrowing. No, Jimmy, I'm handling it. But I'm not going to sit here and let you manipulate me for your ratings. I won't play your game just to get your viral moment. I'm not interested in being your punchline. The crew buzzed with activity, unsure whether to cut to a commercial or let the confrontation play out. But this wasn't entertainment anymore. It was something far more intense. Chris stood there, his anger simmering beneath the surface. You want to make this about controversy, Jimmy? Fine, you can have it. But don't pretend that this isn't exactly what you wanted. You wanted a fight. And you got one. As Chris moved toward the exit, the tension in the studio reached its peak. Jimmy called out, his voice desperate. Chris, wait. Please don't leave. We're still live. Think about the fans, about the label. We've got 8 more minutes left in the show. Chris paused at the door, turning briefly to face Jimmy one last time. You're right about one thing, Jimmy. This isn't a show for real conversations. This is just entertainment. But my life, my career, my principles, they're not just content for your TV program. And I won't be a part of this anymore. With those final words, Chris Stapleton walked out of the studio, leaving behind a stunned host, a silent audience, and millions of viewers watching in disbelief as one of the most dramatic moments in late-night television unfolded live. Jimmy Kimmel stood motionless as the cameras continued rolling, his face a mask of disbelief. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a quick commercial break, he muttered, his voice barely audible. But Chris had one last message before disappearing. Tell them the truth, Jimmy. Not just the part you wanted them to hear. Tell them what really happened tonight. And with that, Chris Stapleton exited the stage, leaving an unforgettable mark on the entertainment world.